The dust, thick as a shroud, clung to everything, to the parched sagebrush, to the cracked earth, and to the ragged dress of the small girl huddled against the splintered fence post. Her name was Little Fawn, though no one had called her that. In days, now she was just a shadow, a wisp of hunger and fear, barely visible in the shimmering heat haze. Her stomach gnawed at itself, a hollow ache that had long since surpassed pain and settled into a dull, constant thrum. Her mother mourning. Star lay a few yards away, her face pressed into the dirt, her body a still heavy burden. The fever had taken her, slowly, mercilessly, leaving Little Fawn utterly alone in a world that had suddenly gone silent, save for the buzzing of flies and the frantic pounding of her own small heart. A wagon rumbled past, its wheels kicking. Up more dust, the faces of the white settlers within it blurred and indifferent. They did not see her, or if they did, they saw only another lost Indian, a nuisance, a ghost of a dying land. Tears, hot and gritty, trapped paths down her dust-streaked cheeks, mingling with the sweat that beaded on her brow. She hadn't cried in a long time. Crying used to bring her mother's soft hands, her whispered songs. Now it brought nothing but the taste of salt and the cold, vast emptiness of the prairie. A shadow fell over her, not the fleeting one of a passing cloud, but a solid, unmoving presence. Little Fawn flinched, pressing herself tighter against the rough wood. A pair of worn leather boots, then denim-clad legs, came into view. She dared to look up, her eyes, wide and dark, meeting a pair of eyes the color of a winter sky, set in. A face weathered by sun and wind, framed by a week's growth of stubble. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked capable of both breaking and building. He knelt slowly, his movements deliberate, as if not to startle a skittish deer. He held out something wrapped in a clean, if patched, cloth. The scent hit her first, rich, earthy, the smell of baked bread and something savory. Her stomach gave a violent lurch, a protest of pure, desperate need. She stared at the offering, then at his face, searching for a trick, a cruel joke. But his eyes held no malice, only a quiet, weary sort of pity. "Eat," he rumbled, his voice low, like distant thunder. It was a command, yet it held a strange, gentle cadence. Little Fawn hesitated, her small hands trembling as she reached out. Her fingers brushed against the cloth, then pulled back as if burned. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. The last mouthful had been a handful of dried berries, shared with her mother, who had smiled weakly and told her to be strong. Strong. The word felt like a lie in her mouth. The man pushed the bundle closer. "It's beef stew. And fresh bread. Go on." The hunger won. Her fingers, thin and bony, fumbled with the cloth, revealing a chunk of dark, crusty bread and a small, earthenware bowl filled with thick, steaming stew. The aroma was intoxicating, a promise of life. She tore off a piece of bread, shoving it into her mouth, chewing frantically, tears blurring her vision again, this time from sheer, overwhelming relief. The warmth of the bread, the savory richness of the stew, spread through her, a small fire igniting in the hollow cavern of her belly. She ate until the bowl was empty, until the last crumb of bread was gone, until the gnawing ache receded, replaced by a dull, comforting fullness. When she looked up again, the man was still there, watching her with that same quiet intensity. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken another word. He simply watched her eat, a silent sentinel. When she finished, he reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the empty bowl and the cloth. "Where's your family, girl?" he asked, his voice softer now. Little Fawn pointed a shaky finger towards the still form of Morning Star. "Mama. She sleeps." The man's gaze followed her finger. He looked at Morning Star for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he rose, his tall frame casting a long shadow over them both. He walked over to Morning Star, knelt beside her, and gently placed 2 fingers against her neck. His jaw tightened. He didn't need to say anything. Little Fawn knew. The silence of the prairie had swallowed her mother whole. A fresh wave of desolation washed over Little Fawn, colder and deeper than any hunger. She was truly alone now. The man stood up, his back to her, his shoulders slumped slightly. He looked out at the vast indifferent landscape, then back at the small grieving girl. "Come on," he said, his voice rough. "You can't stay here." He didn't offer his hand. He simply turned and started walking towards a distant cluster of buildings, a farmhouse, a barn, a windmill turning lazily against the sky. Little Fawn hesitated, her gaze lingering on her mother's still form. But the man didn't look back. He just kept walking, a steady, unhurried pace. With a sob that caught in her throat, Little Fawn scrambled to her feet and followed him, her small legs struggling to keep up with his long strides. She didn't know where she was going or why this man had offered her food. Then silence, then the strange, unspoken invitation. All she knew was the emptiness behind her, and the faint, unsettling hope that flickered in the man's silent offer of a path forward. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the sun dipping lower, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke. Little Fawn's legs ached, but she pushed on, driven by a primal fear of being left behind. Finally, they reached the ranch. It was modest but sturdy. A 2-story farmhouse, a large barn, a few smaller outbuildings, all neatly kept. A dog, a shaggy mongrel with intelligent eyes, trotted out to meet them, sniffing suspiciously at Little Fawn before nudging the man's hand. He led her into the barn, a cavernous space filled with the warm, earthy smell of hay and livestock. A single lantern hung from a beam, casting flickering shadows. A few cows munched contentedly in their stalls, their eyes soft and placid. He pointed to a pile of clean hay in a corner. "You can sleep there," he said, his voice flat. "It's warmer than outside." He didn't offer a blanket or another meal. He simply turned and walked out, the heavy barn door creaking shut behind him, plunging her into near darkness, save for the faint glow of the lantern. Little Fawn curled up in the hay, pulling the sweet-smelling stalks around her, trying to find a warmth that wasn't there. The silence of the barn was different from the silence of the prairie. It was a living silence, filled with the soft breathing of animals, the rustle of hay, but the emptiness inside her remained. She closed, her eyes exhausted, a desperate prayer forming on her lips, a silent plea to a sky that had offered no answers, only shadows. The next morning, the first rays of dawn were just painting the eastern sky when Little Fawn awoke. The barn was still, the air cool and crisp. She stretched, her small body stiff from the hard ground. A faint sound, a murmur of voices reached her from outside. Curiosity, a rare flicker in her dulled spirit, pulled her to her feet. She crept to the main barn door, pushing it open just enough to peer out. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The barn was surrounded, not by cattle or by the quiet expanse of the prairie, but by men. A dozen or more, perhaps. Some on horseback, some standing, their faces grim and set. They carried rifles, their barrels glinting dully in the nascent light. Their eyes, hard and cold, were fixed on the barn, on the very door she was peering through. And in the center, standing a little apart, was a man in a dark suit, his face pinched and severe, a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. He was talking, his voice a low, guttural rumble that carried on the crisp morning air. Little Fawn pulled back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Fear, sharp and icy, pierced through the dull ache of grief. She knew these men. She had seen their kind before. They were the ones who took, who judged, who saw her people as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. And then she heard the rancher's voice, calm and steady, cutting through the tension. "What is it you want, Sheriff?" The sheriff's reply was a snarl laced with contempt. "We know what you're doing, Silas. Hiding that savage. In your barn. We're here to take her." Little Fawn pressed herself against the rough wood of the barn door, her small body trembling. The rancher Silas had given her food. He had given her shelter, and now, because of her, his barn was surrounded. The shadow that had arrived in the dust yesterday had brought with it not answers, but a chilling, undeniable threat. Silas stood on the porch of his farmhouse, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand, his gaze sweeping over the grim faces arrayed before him. The morning chill bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a quiet, dangerous glint. He knew most of these men. Farmers, ranchers, a few shopkeepers from the nearby town of Havenwood. And Sheriff Brody, a man whose ambition outweighed his sense of justice, a man who saw the world in stark, unforgiving lines of black and white, civilized and savage. "You're mistaken, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice low, steady, cutting. Through the tense silence, "There's no savage here. Just a lost child." Brody scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "A lost child, Silas. Or a trespasser? A thief? You know the rules. No Indians on private land, especially not on a ranch bordering the reservation. You're harboring, Silas. That's a serious offense." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Silas heard the familiar words, sharp and venomous. Indian, trouble, tainted. He'd heard them all his life, directed at anyone who dared to step outside the rigid boundaries of their prejudiced world. Silas took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension build. He felt the weight of their judgment, the cold, hard stares. He was Silas Blackwood, a man who had carved his ranch out of unforgiving land, a man who had buried his wife Ilara and their unborn child 2 years ago, leaving him with a hollow ache that no amount of hard work or solitude could fill. He was a man who kept to himself, who rarely ventured into Havenwood, and who had no patience for the small-mindedness that festered there. He had found Little Fawn yesterday, a starving ghost beside her dead mother, a sight that had ripped through the carefully constructed walls around his heart. He hadn't thought, hadn't planned. He had simply acted, driven by a primal urge to alleviate suffering, an echo of the compassion his own lost Ilara had embodied. Now that simple act had brought the wrath of Havenwood to his doorstep. "She was starving, Brody," Silas stated, his voice devoid of emotion, yet carrying an undeniable force. "Her mother was dead. What was I supposed to do? Leave her to the wolves?" "That's not your concern, Blackwood," Brody retorted, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "The reservation is for their kind. Not here. We have laws. And we have a community to protect." "Protect from what, Sheriff?" Silas challenged, his gaze unwavering. "From a hungry child?" A few men shifted uncomfortably, but most remained, stony-faced. The prejudice ran deep, a poison in the veins of the frontier. "She's a wild Indian, Silas," one of the farmers, a man named Jebediah Cole, spat out. "They bring nothing but trouble, sickness, stealing. We don't want her here." "She's a human being, Jebediah," Silas countered, his voice hardening. "And she's under my roof. You want her, you'll have to come through me." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Brody's face darkened, a vein throbbing in his temple. "Are you defying the law, Blackwood?" "I'm defending what's right," Silas said, setting his coffee mug down on the porch railing with a deliberate clink. His hands, calloused and strong, hung loosely at his sides. He wasn't armed, a deliberate choice. He wanted no bloodshed. Not yet, but his stance, his quiet defiance, spoke volumes. Inside the barn, Little Fawn listened, her small body pressed against the rough wood, every word a sharp splinter in her heart. She understood enough. They wanted her gone. They saw her as a threat. And the man who had given her food, The man who had offered her a sliver of hope was now standing against them for her. A strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in her chest, a tiny, fragile flower in the barren landscape of her grief. Brody took a step forward, his eyes narrowed. "This is your last chance, Blackwood. Hand her over, or we come in and take her." The air crackled with unspoken threats. Rifles were subtly raised. The men tightened their circle around the barn. It was a standoff. Silas knew he couldn't fight them all. He was one man against a dozen, heavily armed. But he also knew he couldn't simply hand little Fawn over. He had seen the way they looked at her, the contempt in their eyes. He knew what awaited her if she was taken by them, a life of servitude, or worse, a slow, grinding erasure of her spirit. Then, an idea, desperate and audacious, sparked in his mind. It was a gamble, a last resort, but it was the only path he saw that didn't end in violence or surrender. "All right, Brody," Silas said, his voice cutting through the tension, making the sheriff pause. "You want her gone from my land? Fine, I'll make you a deal." Brody's eyebrows shot up, a flicker of surprise in his hard eyes. "A deal? What kind of deal?" "A legal one," Silas stated, his gaze sweeping over the assembled men, meeting each hostile stare with his own unwavering resolve. "She's a child, an orphan. If she's to be removed from my care, it must be done through legal channels. I'll go to the courthouse in Havenwood. I'll petition the judge for guardianship. If the judge rules against me, if he says she must go, then I'll take her to the reservation myself. No fuss, no trouble. But until then, she stays here with me." A murmur went through the crowd. A legal challenge. That was unexpected. It wasn't the immediate, satisfying confrontation they had hoped for. Brody hesitated, his mind clearly weighing the options. A forced entry, a shootout, would be messy. It would draw attention, perhaps even from the territorial authorities. A legal battle, while inconvenient, would be cleaner. And he was confident the judge, a man of Havenwood, would side with them. Guardianship? Brody sneered, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "You, Silas Blackwood, want to be guardian? To an Indian child, what would your dear departed wife say?" The jab landed, a sharp blow to Silas's carefully guarded heart. Elara, he could almost hear her voice, soft yet firm, urging him to compassion, to do what was right, regardless of the cost. He met Brody's gaze, his own eyes colder than ever. "Elara would say I'm doing precisely what she would have done," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "She believed in decency, Brody. Something you seem to have forgotten." Brody's face flushed with anger, but he held his tongue. The mention of Elara, a woman widely respected for her kindness, had a subtle effect on some of the men. They knew Silas's grief, his quiet struggle. "All right, Blackwood," Brody finally conceded, his voice tight with reluctant acceptance. "You want to play by the rules? We'll play by the rules. Be at the courthouse, 10 o'clock, 3 days. From now, and don't think of trying to run. We'll be watching." Silas simply nodded. He watched as Brody turned, barking orders, and the men slowly, reluctantly, dispersed, their horses' hooves kicking up dust as they rode away. The silence that descended was heavy, pregnant with unspoken threats. He stood there for a long moment, watching the last of them disappear over the horizon. Then, he turned and walked towards the barn. He pushed the door open, the creak echoing in the quiet. Little Fawn was still huddled in the corner, her eyes wide, watching him. He knelt down, his gaze soft. "They're gone for now," he said, his voice gentle, "but we have a fight ahead of us. A different kind of fight." Little Fawn stared at him, her young mind grappling with the words, with the enormity of what had just transpired. She didn't understand guardianship or courthouse, but she understood fight, and she understood that this man, this stranger, had chosen to fight for her. A fragile, trembling hope took root in her heart, a warmth spreading. through her veins that was far more profound than the warmth of the stew he had given her. It was the warmth of being seen, of being chosen, even by a broken man in a broken world. The days that followed were a blur of quiet, intense activity. Silas, a man accustomed to solitude, found his routine irrevocably altered. Little Fawn, whose name he now knew was Alara, a painful echo of his lost wife, moved through his world like a silent, watchful shadow. He had given her a small, clean room in the farmhouse, a room that had once been meant for the child he and his Alara would never have. It was sparse, with a narrow bed and a small wooden chest, but it was clean, and it was hers. The first few meals were awkward. Silas cooked simple, hearty fare: bacon, eggs, beans, cornbread. Alara ate slowly, meticulously, as if savoring every bite, her eyes never leaving his face. She spoke little, her English hesitant, broken by long silences. He learned to read her expressions, the flicker of fear in her eyes when a loud noise startled her, the subtle curve of her lips when she found something amusing, the deep, quiet sadness that seemed to perpetually cling to her. He tried to teach her simple chores: how to feed the chickens, how to gather eggs, how to sweep the porch. She learned quickly, her small hands surprisingly adept, her movements graceful. But there was always a distance between them, a chasm of unspoken grief and cultural difference. He was a white rancher, she was a Native American child. The world had drawn a harsh line between them, and neither knew how to fully cross it. One afternoon, Silas found her sitting by the creek, her knees drawn up to her chest, a small, intricate carving of a bird clutched in her hand. It was a beautiful piece, carved from a smooth piece of wood, its wings outstretched as if in flight. "Did you make that?" he asked, his voice soft, not wanting to break the fragile piece. Alara nodded, her gaze fixed on the carving. "Mama, she teach me." A pang went through Silas. He remembered Alara, his Alara, teaching him how to mend fences, how to identify different wildflowers. The shared lessons, the quiet moments of connection. "It's beautiful," he said, genuinely. "Your mother was a talented woman." Alara looked up at him, a flicker of something in her eyes, pride, perhaps, or a brief easing of her perpetual sorrow. "She she tells stories." Silas nodded, a lump in his throat. "My Alara, she loved to sing too. And she told stories about the stars." A silence fell between them, a shared moment of grief for the women they had lost. It was the first time they had truly connected, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two broken souls, bound by loss. He started teaching her more: how to saddle a horse, how to mend a torn shirt, how to identify edible plants in the prairie. He found himself talking more too, explaining things, sometimes just narrating his day as he worked, the sound of his voice filling the quiet house. He didn't expect her to understand everything, but he hoped the rhythm of his words, the steady presence of his voice, would offer some comfort. One evening, a fierce thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the small farmhouse to its foundations. The wind howled like a banshee, rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked directly overhead, making the very ground tremble. Alara, who had been quietly drawing by the flickering lamplight, flinched violently at each clap of thunder, her small body tensing. Silas watched her, a knot forming in his stomach. He remembered his own Alara, how she would sometimes cling to him during storms, seeking comfort. He walked over to Alara, knelt beside her, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, little fawn," he said, using the name he had heard her mother whisper. "Just a storm. It'll pass." Alara looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't speak, but her trembling was palpable. Without thinking, Silas pulled her into a hug, a clumsy, awkward embrace. Her small body was stiff at first, then, slowly, tentatively, she leaned into him, burying her face against his chest. He felt her small hands grip his shirt, clinging. To him, he held her, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his own, feeling the fragile weight of her trust. He began to hum, a low, tuneless melody, something his own father used to hum when he was a boy. He felt her relax just a fraction against him. It was not love, not yet. It was something far more raw, more fundamental. It was the slow, painful process of two broken pieces of humanity finding a way to fit together, to offer each other a fragile shelter in a world that sought to shatter them. There were still long, emotionally loaded silences, moments where he nearly gave up on bridging the gap, moments where he saw the deep, unyielding sorrow in her eyes and felt helpless. But then, there would be a small gesture, Ilara leaving a carefully polished stone on his workbench, or a faint, almost imperceptible smile, and he would know, with a quiet certainty, that they were not giving up. Not yet. The courthouse loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon, but for now, in the flickering lamplight, in the heart of the storm, they were simply two souls finding a fragile solace in each other's presence. The news of Silas Blackwood's audacious plan spread through Havenwood like wildfire, igniting a furious debate. The general store, the saloon, the church, every gathering place buzzed with whispers, accusations, and indignant pronouncements. "He's gone soft in the head, that Silas," old Mrs. Gable declared, her voice sharp as a rusty nail, as she sorted through bolts of fabric at the general store. "Bringing a heathen into his home, after what they did to his own kind. She was bought, wasn't she?" Jebediah Cole sneered to a group of men gathered outside the saloon, spitting tobacco juice onto the dusty street. "He found her on the reservation land, probably paid some chief for her. A man can't just claim an Indian child like a stray dog. A barren woman, he lost his wife, and now he takes on a wild one," another man muttered, shaking his head. "Foolish, just plain foolish." The prejudice was a thick, suffocating blanket over the town. The idea of a white man, especially one like Silas Blackwood, a respected if reclusive rancher, taking in a Native American child as his own, was an affront to their deeply ingrained beliefs. It challenged their sense of order, their perceived superiority. They saw it as a betrayal, a dangerous precedent. Sheriff Brody, fueled by the town's outrage and his own rigid sense of justice, fanned the flames. He made it clear that he intended to fight Silas's petition with every fiber of his being. He spoke of the safety of the community, of preserving our way of life, and of the inherent dangers of allowing a savage to be integrated into their society. Yet, amidst the chorus of condemnation, there were dissenting voices, quiet at first, then growing bolder. Not everyone in Havenwood was consumed by hatred. The first crack in the wall of judgment came from Martha Jenkins, the town's seamstress. Martha was a widow herself, her hands gnarled from years of stitching, her eyes kind and knowing. She had known Silas's wife, Ilara, well. She remembered Ilara's gentle spirit, her quiet acts of charity. One afternoon, as Mrs. Gable was loudly denouncing Silas's actions, Martha spoke up, her voice surprisingly firm. Ilara Blackwood was a good woman. She believed in helping those in need, no matter their color. "I reckon Silas is just following her example." Mrs. Gable spluttered. But Martha continued, her gaze steady. "And that child, she's just a child, lost, alone. What would any of you do if it were your own kin? Left to starve on the prairie?" Her words, simple and direct, caused a ripple of discomfort. Some averted their eyes. Others mumbled. Then came the quiet support of Thomas Miller, the blacksmith. Thomas was a man of few words, but his work was honest, his integrity unquestionable. He had known Silas for years, respected his quiet strength. When Jebediah Cole tried to rally support for a boycott of Silas's ranch, Thomas simply leaned against his anvil, his powerful arms crossed, and said, "Silas Blackwood pays his debts. He works his land. And he's never done a dishonest days. work in his life. I'll not stand against a man for showing a bit of mercy. Small acts of defiance. A quiet nod from a farmer when Silas rode into town for supplies. A discreet offering of fresh vegetables left on his porch by an anonymous hand. The initial outrage began to curdle, replaced by a simmering tension, a division within the community. Itself, some hardened their hearts, convinced Silas was a fool. Others, stirred by Martha's words or Thomas's quiet example, began to question their own prejudices. The children, surprisingly, were the first to truly break through the barrier. One afternoon, Silas took Alara to the creek to fish. A group of Havenwood children were already there, splashing and laughing. At first, they stared, their games falling silent. Alara, sensing their scrutiny, stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for Silas's. But then, a small boy, no older than Alara, dropped his fishing line and walked towards her, holding out a smooth, colorful stone. "It's pretty," he mumbled, his cheeks flushed. "For luck." Alara hesitated, then slowly, tentatively, reached out and took the stone. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was a tiny gesture, but it was a bridge. Soon, other children, their curiosity overcoming their parents' prejudices, began to approach, offering small gifts, asking shy questions. Saw a child, not a savage. They saw a girl who could carve beautiful birds, who could move silently through the tall grass, who had a quiet, knowing gaze. The adults watched, some with disapproval, others with a dawning realization. The children, unburdened by the years of ingrained prejudice, were simply seeing another human being. These small acts of solidarity, these quiet moments of acceptance, began to turn the venomous whispers into something else, a grudging respect, a hesitant curiosity. The courthouse date loomed, a final test, but the ground had shifted beneath Havenwood's feet. The fight for Alara was no longer just Silas's fight. It was becoming a fight for the very soul of the community itself. The courthouse in Havenwood was a squat, imposing building, its brick facade stained by years of dust and rain. On the morning of the hearing, a crowd had gathered, spilling out onto the street. Curiosity, animosity, and a few glimmers of support mingled in the air, thick and oppressive. Sheriff Brody stood at the entrance, his arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. He had rallied his supporters, and they stood in a tight, unyielding phalanx. Silas arrived with Alara, his old wagon creaking slowly down the street. Alara sat beside him, her small hand clutching his, her face pale but resolute. She wore a simple, clean dress Martha Jenkins had made for her, a small act of kindness that had spoken louder than any words. Silas wore his best, if worn, suit, his boots polished, his hair neatly combed. He looked every inch the respectable rancher, a deliberate choice to counter the image Brody had tried to paint. As they stepped down from the wagon, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes were on Alara, then on Silas. He felt the weight of their judgment, the palpable tension. He squeezed Alara's hand, a silent promise of protection. Inside, the courtroom was stifling, packed to capacity. Judge Abernathy, a stern, unyielding man with a reputation for upholding the letter of the law, sat behind his high bench, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. The hearing began. Sheriff Brody presented his case first, his voice booming, filled with righteous indignation. He spoke of Indian incursions, of threats to property and peace, of the danger of allowing an unsupervised native child to roam freely. He painted Silas as naive, reckless, and a potential threat to the community's safety. He called Jebediah Cole to testify, who recounted exaggerated tales of Native American raids and thefts, implying Alara was a harbinger of such trouble. Silas listened, his face impassive, but his grip on Alara's hand tightened. He could feel her trembling beside him. Then it was Silas's turn. He rose, tall and unbending. He spoke simply, directly, without flourish. He told the story of finding Alara, of her mother's death, of the desperate hunger in her eyes. He spoke of her quiet resilience, her quick learning, her gentle nature. He didn't try to romanticize it. He simply laid out the facts, raw and unvarnished. "She is an orphan, Judge," Silas stated, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "She has no one. I am offering her a home, a chance at a life. Not as a servant, not as a ward of the state, but as a member of my family." A ripple went through the courtroom. Family. The word hung in the air, audacious, provocative. Brody scoffed. "Family, Blackwood? You can't just claim a child of another race as your own. It's unnatural. It's against everything we stand for." Silas turned to Brody, his eyes blazing with a quiet fury. "What is unnatural, Sheriff, is leaving a child to die. What is unnatural is turning your back on suffering. What is unnatural is judging a soul by the color of their skin." He then called Martha Jenkins to the stand. Martha, despite her nervousness, spoke with quiet dignity, testifying to Alara's good character, to Silas's kindness, and to the dress she had sewn. "She's just a little girl, Judge," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly. "A quiet, sweet little girl who needs a home." Thomas Miller, the blacksmith, also testified, speaking of Silas's integrity and his belief that a man's actions, not his words, defined him. The courtroom was divided. Some nodded in agreement, their faces softening. Others remained stony, their prejudice unyielding. Judge Abernathy listened, his expression unreadable. He asked probing questions, testing Silas's resolve, questioning his motives. Silas answered each one with unwavering honesty. Finally, the judge leaned back, his gaze fixed on Alara. "Child," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "do you wish to stay with Mr. Blackwood?" All eyes turned to Alara. She looked at Silas, then at the judge, then at the sea of faces in the courtroom. Her small voice, though barely a whisper, carried in the sudden profound silence. He saved me," she said, her English halting, but her meaning clear. Good." She looked back at Silas, her eyes filled with an unspoken plea. "I stay." The simplicity of her words, the raw honesty of her plea, struck a chord. A few sniffles could be heard in the courtroom. Even some of Brody's supporters looked away, uncomfortable. Judge Abernathy closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them. He looked at Silas, then at Brody, then at the assembled townspeople. "This court," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, "is bound by the laws of this territory. And those laws, while imperfect, do not forbid a man from taking an orphan into his care, regardless of their heritage, so long as he can prove he is capable and willing to provide for them." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Mr. Blackwood has demonstrated, through his actions and the testimony of credible witnesses, that he has provided for this child and intends to continue to do so. The child herself has expressed a desire to remain in his care." Brody's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. He started to protest, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Therefore," Judge Abernathy continued, his voice ringing with authority, "it is the ruling of this court that Silas Blackwood is hereby granted temporary guardianship of the child, Alara. A full review will be conducted in 6 months. Until then, any harassment or interference with Mr. Blackwood or Alara will be met with the full force of the law." A stunned silence filled the courtroom, then a ripple of murmurs, both of relief and outrage. Silas felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, followed by a quiet, profound sense of victory. He looked at Alara, whose face was still pale, but whose eyes now held a glimmer of something new, a fragile hope, a dawning understanding. As they walked out of the courthouse, the crowd parted, some still glaring, others offering hesitant nods of respect. Brody stood by the door, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he snarled, his voice low and menacing. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning. They'll never accept her, and neither will I." Silas stopped, turning to face the sheriff, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Maybe not, Brody," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But she has a home now, and she has a family, and that's a start." He looked down at Alara, whose small hand was still clasped tightly in his, "and we'll fight for that, every step of the way." The battle was won, but the war, he knew, had only just begun. The final test was not just the court, but the unforgiving heart of the frontier itself. The 6 months that followed the court's ruling were a crucible, forging Silas and Alara into something akin to a family. The temporary guardianship meant they were under constant scrutiny, every action watched, every interaction noted by the ever-present eyes of Havenwood. Sheriff Brody, true to his word, made their lives difficult, finding petty reasons to ride out to the ranch, inspecting fences, questioning Silas's farming practices, always with a cold, assessing gaze fixed on Alara. But the judge's ruling had also given them a shield, a fragile legitimacy. And within the walls of Silas's ranch, a new rhythm of life began to form. Alara, now officially Alara Blackwood, though the name felt strange and heavy on her tongue, slowly began to shed her shell. She learned to speak English with greater fluency, her soft accent a constant reminder of her heritage. She helped Silas with the chores, her small hands growing stronger, her knowledge of the land, inherited from her mother, proving invaluable. She knew where the wild berries grew sweetest, how to track small game, which herbs could soothe a fever. Silas, in turn, taught her about the ranch, about the care of livestock, about the intricate dance of planting and harvesting. There were still moments of profound awkwardness, of cultural clashes. Silas, a man of few words, struggled to understand Alara's quiet moments of reflection, her deep connection to the spirit world, her need for solitude. She, in turn, struggled with his pragmatic, often blunt, approach to life, his unspoken grief that still hung heavy in the air like a persistent fog. One evening, Silas found her sitting by the creek, a small fire burning, singing a low, haunting melody in her native tongue. Her eyes were closed, her face serene. He watched her for a long time, a strange ache in his chest. When she finished, she opened her eyes and saw him. A flicker of self-consciousness crossed her face. "Mama." "She sing this," Alara explained, her voice soft. "For good dreams." Silas nodded, a lump in his throat. "It's beautiful, Alara." He sat beside her, the firelight dancing on their faces. "Will you teach me?" Alara's eyes widened slightly, a hint of surprise. Then a slow, tentative smile touched her lips. She began to hum the melody again, softly, patiently, teaching him the words, explaining their meaning. It was a small act, but it was a profound bridge, a sharing of worlds that had long been kept separate. The community's response remained a complex tapestry of judgment and solidarity. The hardliners, led by Brody and Jebediah Cole, continued their whispers, their cold stares. They spread rumors, questioned Alara's presence, and tried to isolate Silas, but their efforts were increasingly met with quiet resistance. Martha Jenkins continued to be a staunch ally, visiting the ranch with home-baked pies, offering Alara sewing lessons, treating her with genuine affection. Thomas Miller, the blacksmith, would often leave small, expertly crafted tools on Silas's porch, silent tokens of support. Even some of the children who had initially been wary now sought out Alara, drawn by her quiet wisdom and her ability to tell captivating stories of the wilderness. One particularly brutal winter storm hit the prairie, a blizzard that trapped everyone in their homes, burying the land under feet of snow. Silas's barn, old but sturdy, groaned under the weight. The wind howled, a relentless, icy shriek. Silas worked tirelessly, ensuring the livestock were safe, the house warm. Alara, despite her small size, helped him, her movements quick and efficient, her spirit undaunted by the cold. When the storm finally broke, leaving behind a world transformed into a pristine, silent white, Silas discovered a section of the barn roof had collapsed under the snow's weight, leaving a gaping hole. It was a disaster. The livestock were exposed, vulnerable to the bitter cold. He couldn't fix it alone, not quickly enough. He rode into Havenwood, the snow crunching under his horse's hooves, his face grim. He needed help, but he dreaded asking for it. He knew Brody would use this as another opportunity to undermine him. He found Thomas Miller first, explaining the situation. Thomas, without a word, simply nodded. "I'll get my tools. Be there by midday." Word spread quickly. Brody, hearing of the collapsed roof, rode out to Silas's ranch, a triumphant smirk on his face. He expected to find Silas defeated, ready to surrender Alara. Instead, he found a growing number of wagons and men arriving, their faces grim but determined. Thomas Miller was already there, assessing the damage. Martha Jenkins arrived with a wagon full of hot coffee and food. Even a few men who had previously been hostile, men who had been part of Brody's initial posse, arrived, their expressions conflicted, but their hands ready to work. "What's the meaning of this, Blackwood?" Brody demanded, his voice tight with frustration. Silas looked at the gathering men, his gaze sweeping over their faces, a quiet understanding passing between them. "It means, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice steady, "that a community helps its own, even when some try to prevent it." The men began to work, a flurry of hammers, saws, and shouted instructions. They worked tirelessly, side by side, white and Native American, men who had once been strangers now united by a common purpose. Alara, small but determined, helped where she could, carrying tools, fetching water, her presence a silent testament to the reason for their gathering. Brody watched, his face growing red with impotent rage. His authority, his carefully constructed narrative of division, was crumbling before his eyes. He saw the quiet cooperation, the shared labor, the growing respect in the eyes of the men who had once followed him blindly. He saw Martha Jenkins laughing with Alara as they shared a cup of hot coffee. He saw Thomas Miller, his face streaked with sweat and grime, working alongside Silas, their movements in sync. By sundown, the roof was repaired, stronger than before. The men gathered, tired but satisfied, the camaraderie palpable. They had worked together not as factions, but as neighbors. As the last of the men prepared to leave, Brody stepped forward, his voice tight with a desperate, final challenge. "You think this changes anything, Blackwood? You think a few planks of wood will erase what she is, what you are doing?" Silas turned to face him, his face tired but resolute. "No, Brody," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It doesn't erase anything. It builds something. Something stronger than your hate. Something that can withstand any storm." He looked at Alara, who stood beside him, her small hand once again finding his. "It builds a family. And a community that chooses to see beyond fear." Brody stared at them, defeated, then turned and rode away, his figure shrinking into the twilight. The court review was still months away, but the final test had already begun. Not in a courtroom, but in the heart of a community. In the shared labor of men and women who were slowly, painfully, choosing compassion over prejudice. The fight for family, for love, for justice was not just a legal battle. It was a daily struggle, one brick by brick, act by act, in the harsh, beautiful landscape of the American frontier. The 6 months passed, marked by the changing seasons, by the slow, steady growth of the ranch, and by the deepening bond between Silas and Alara. The second court review was less of a battle, more of a formality. Judge Abernathy, having received glowing reports from Martha Jenkins and Thomas Miller, and having witnessed the subtle shift in Havenwood's sentiment, granted Silas permanent guardianship. The legal hurdle was cleared, but the true test, the daily fight for acceptance and belonging, continued. Elara flourished under Silas's care. Her laughter, once a rare, fragile sound, now echoed through the farmhouse. She learned to read and write, devouring every book Silas possessed. She taught him more about her people's ways, about the rhythms of the earth, about the stories whispered by the wind. He, in turn, shared his own quiet wisdom, his resilience, his unwavering belief in hard work and honesty. They were a family not by blood, but by choice, forged in the fires of loss and tempered by the harsh realities of the frontier, yet the scars remained. Elara carried the memory of her mother, a deep, quiet sorrow that would sometimes cloud her eyes. Silas carried the ghost of his Elara, a wound that had never truly healed. And the community, while more accepting, still held pockets of resentment, of prejudice that flared up occasionally, like embers in a dying fire. Then came the spring of the great drought. The rains failed, the creeks dwindled to trickles. The prairie, usually a vibrant green, turned brittle and brown. Crops withered in the fields. Livestock grew thin. Panic began to spread through Havenwood. Farmers watched their livelihoods shrivel, their hopes turn to dust. Sheriff Brody, ever opportunistic, saw his chance. He began to spread rumors, whispering that the drought was a curse, a punishment for Silas's unnatural act of taking in an Indian child. He spoke of ancient spirits angered, of tainted land. Fear, a potent weapon, began to turn the community against Silas and Elara once more. One sweltering afternoon, a group of desperate farmers, their faces gaunt with worry and anger, rode out to Silas's ranch. Jebediah Cole was among them, his eyes wild with desperation. "It's her, Silas," Jebediah shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Elara, who stood beside Silas, her face pale but defiant. "She's brought this curse upon us. The land is angry." The other farmers muttered in agreement, their eyes filled with a desperate, superstitious fear. They were looking for someone to blame, a scapegoat for their suffering. Silas stepped forward, shielding Elara with his body. "This is madness," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the rising hysteria. "The drought is a natural disaster. Not a curse, not her fault. Then why Blackwood?" Jebediah screamed, his voice cracking. "Why is our land dying? Why are our children hungry? It's because of her. Because of what you've done." The crowd surged forward, their anger palpable, their desperation turning into a dangerous mob mentality. Silas knew this was the final test. This was not a legal battle, not a quiet standoff. This was a raw, brutal confrontation fueled by fear and prejudice, a fight for their very lives, for their dignity, for the fragile family they had built. "You want to blame someone?" Silas roared, his voice suddenly booming, cutting through the din, silencing the crowd. "Blame yourselves. Blame your fear. Blame your ignorance." He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the desperate faces. "This land is dying because we've forgotten how to live with it. We've taken, and we haven't given back. We haven't listened to its whispers." He turned to Elara, then back to the crowd. Elara's people, they lived with this land for generations. They understood its rhythms. They respected its power. They knew how to survive its droughts, its blizzards, its fires. He pointed to the parched fields, then to the sky. "You want rain? You want your crops to grow? You want your children to eat? Then stop blaming a child. Stop clinging to your hatred. Start learning. Start listening." Jebediah Cole scoffed. "What are you saying, Blackwood? That she has some magic? Some Indian trick?" "No magic, Jebediah," Elara said, her voice small but clear, stepping out from behind Silas, her gaze steady, unwavering. "Just knowledge, just respect." She looked at the parched earth, then at the desperate faces of the farmers. My mother. She'd teach me about the water, about the plants, about the earth. She pointed to a distant cluster of stunted trees. Barely visible on the horizon, there is a spring. Deep in the canyon, it never dries. My people, they know. A ripple of skepticism, then a flicker of desperate hope went through the crowd. A spring? In this drought? It seemed impossible. She's lying. Brody shouted, riding up, his face grim. Don't listen to her. She's a savage. She'll lead you to your deaths. Silas stepped forward, his hand resting on Alara's shoulder, a silent gesture of unwavering support. She's not lying, Brody. She's offering hope. Something you've never done. He looked at the farmers. It's a long journey, dangerous, through rough terrain. But if you're willing to put aside your fear, your prejudice, and trust a child who knows this land better than any of us, then we can try. The farmers looked at each other, their faces etched with doubt, then with a desperate, flickering hope. Their crops were dying, their families were starving. What did they have to lose? We'll go, Thomas Miller said, stepping forward, his voice firm. We'll follow her. We'll trust her. Others, hesitant at first, slowly began to nod. The desperation outweighed the prejudice. The need for survival superseded their ingrained biases. The next morning, a small caravan set out from Havenwood. Silas, Ilara, Thomas Miller, Martha Jenkins, and a dozen other farmers, their wagons loaded with empty barrels and their faces grim with determination. Brody watched them leave, his face a mask of furious disbelief, but he could do nothing. The community had chosen. Ilara led them, her small figure walking confidently ahead, her eyes scanning the landscape, reading the subtle signs that were invisible to the white settlers. She navigated through canyons, over rocky ridges, through dense thickets, her knowledge of the land uncanny. Silas rode beside her, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and trepidation. He saw the fear in the eyes of the farmers, the lingering doubt, but he also saw a growing respect as Ilara unerringly led them through the unforgiving terrain. Days turned into a grueling week. The sun beat down mercilessly. Water supplies dwindled, tempers frayed. Some of the farmers began to grumble, questioning Ilara, questioning Silas. She's leading us astray, Blackwood. Jebediah Cole shouted. One evening, his voice hoarse with thirst. There's no spring out here. We're going to die. Silas faced him, his eyes hard. We're not turning back, Jebediah. Not now. We trust Ilara. Ilara, overhearing them, walked over to a cluster of rocks, her small hands digging into the dry earth. She pulled out a handful of damp soil. Soon, she whispered, holding it out. Very soon. The next morning, as the sun began to climb, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ilara stopped. She pointed to a narrow crevice in a sheer rock face. There, she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. The spring. The farmers rushed forward, their hearts pounding with a desperate hope. They squeezed through the crevice, their eyes widening at the sight. A small, hidden pool of water, clear and cool, shimmered in the depths of the canyon, fed by a steady trickle from the rock face. It was not a gushing river, but it was enough. Enough to fill their barrels, enough to quench their thirst, enough to save their farms. A cheer erupted, echoing through the canyon. Men fell to their knees, cupping the cool water in their hands, drinking deeply. They looked at Ilara, their faces filled not with prejudice, but with awe, with gratitude. They spent 2 days at the spring, resting, replenishing their supplies. Ilara taught them how to find other water sources, how to conserve what they had, how to read the signs of the land. She shared her knowledge freely, generously, without a hint of bitterness for the years of scorn and hatred she had endured. When they returned to Havenwood, their wagons laden with precious water, the town erupted in a mixture of relief and shame. The drought was not over, but they had found a lifeline. And they had found it not through their own stubbornness, but through the wisdom of a child they had once scorned. The community stood witness. They had been broken by the drought, by their fear, by their prejudice. Now they were beginning to heal, not just from the lack of water, but from the spiritual emptiness that had consumed them. The final resolution came not with a grand pronouncement, but with a series of small, profound acts. The farmers, humbled and grateful, began to treat Silas and Ilara with a newfound respect. The whispers of savage faded, replaced by quiet nods, by offers of help, by an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared humanity. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves turned to fiery hues, a small wedding was held on Silas's ranch. It was not a grand affair, but it was filled with warmth and genuine affection. Silas stood beneath the open sky, his hand in Martha Jenkins's, her kind eyes shining with a quiet joy. Martha, who had lost her own husband years ago, had found a quiet companionship with Silas, a shared understanding of loss and resilience. Ilara stood beside them, a small flower girl, her face beaming. The family was formed, not by blood, but by choice, by shared hardship, by the quiet, unwavering power of love. The community gathered, not just the few who had supported them, but many who had once been hostile. They stood witness, not just to a wedding, but to a transformation. They saw Silas, a man who had been broken by grief, now whole again, his heart open to love and family. They saw Martha, a lonely widow, finding companionship and purpose. And they saw Ilara, a lost child, now a cherished daughter, her spirit vibrant, her future bright. The ranch, once a solitary outpost, became a beacon of hope. The collapsed barn roof, repaired by the hands of a united community, stood as a testament to their shared struggle and their ultimate triumph. The spring in the canyon, a secret known only to Ilara's people, became a shared resource, a symbol of their interconnectedness. Years passed. The drought eventually broke, and the land healed. Ilara grew into a strong, wise young woman, a bridge between two worlds. She taught the children of Heavenwood about the land, about respect, about the stories of her ancestors. She became a healer, her knowledge of herbs and remedies a blessing to the community. Silas and Martha grew old. Together, their love a quiet, steady flame. They watched Ilara thrive, their hearts full. The scars of the past remained, etched into their memories, but they had been turned into strength, into wisdom. One clear, star-filled night, Silas sat on the porch with Ilara, the familiar sounds of the prairie around them. He looked at the vast, silent sky, then at the young woman beside him, his heart overflowing. "You saved me, little fawn," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "More than I saved you," Ilara smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. She reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and firm. "We saved each other, Papa," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of stars. This is what love, family, and redemption feel like."